Come on, come on. There it goes. All right, sweet. Okay, cool. So good morning, party people. Every now and then I have to reboot my audio piece, my little piece of audio gear, my Claret, Focusrite Claret, and I keep forgetting. I need to put it on a timer. I've got like electric outlets, Belkin or whoever, Wemo outlets that I can set up on timers, so I should totally do that. Not the DBA you're looking for. Said the slippers really complete the look. I don't think of myself as like an UGG slippers person, but Aaron Stellato was like, "Oh, you should try these for telecommuting," and they're wonderful. I do have to go through them like every 6 months because the padding wears out because I'm fat. And then, so it's just because I stand in them a lot. I'm sure UGG slippers weren't designed for people to stand in them like 6 hours a day. And somebody else had asked too, like when I do sessions, whenever I'm with y'all, and also when I'm with clients, when I'm doing that clienting thing, they're like, you're always standing. Don't you ever want to sit? And I do sit when I am doing stuff like consulting, like working on T-SQL scripts or whatever. So I've got a motorized desk and I just push a button and it goes down to the like seated position. And then I got a chair around the corner and I just pull the chair out. So a bunch of people in here, Andy Leonard, Steve Earl, Mossy Moss, good to see you again. DJ Khalid, saw the email from DJ Khalid, good to see you again. Ringazine, good to see you too over there. Tanya, good morning. Oh, G Surgeon says gloomy and rainy in the Netherlands. And it's funny. I took my dad over to Amsterdam, Isle of Man, and I forget the other place that we went. And it was pouring down rain in Amsterdam, like almost the whole time we were there. And so I showed him the red light district in the pouring rain, and I thought that was kind of appropriate. It was kind of interesting. Good morning to Bolivia, too, as well. Oh, Kurt, good to see you, too, as well. So today is one of those open question and answer office hours where you can ask anything. I want to say there was one. Yep, let me go grab the question that came in just a second ago. Let me go grab that and put that into the queue just so that we've got it. Mike Walsh, good to see you, Mike. And Nick Craver, oh, he's even got a Twitch account. Damn, look at that. Angeline from London, good to see you. Darius says, hi Brent, is it worth it just to upgrade from SQL Server 2017 to 2019? And we should totally have Nick Craver chime in because they've had all kinds of fun with that as well. So from 2017 to 2019, so here's the thing. SQL Server 2017 is pretty baked, is pretty stable at this point. There aren't a lot of radical problems with stability. 2019 has had 8 cumulative updates so far. CU7 was pulled. People were told to uninstall it and wait. 3 of them involved corruption bugs. 3 of the cumulative updates were in corruption bugs. That's actually a good question, too. I was watching his MacBook problems with kind of amusement. So it hasn't been very stable. Because of that, I'm kind of like, I don't know. Some of the features, too, that they initially brought out were like trumpeted widely. A scalar UDF inlining was one of them. And they've been taking things out more than they've been adding it back in. People keep announcing bugs with it or finding bugs with it. And Microsoft's way of fixing them is to pull that support out of SQL Server 2019. So you can be in the situation where your code goes faster on 2019 when it first gets deployed and then goes slower again with cumulative updates as you discover that the results were inaccurate and Microsoft starts pulling the features. So I used to recommend that clients always go for a version after it's been out for like 6 or 7 months. Right now, I don't think that people should go to SQL Server 2019, and I know that's not going to make me. Andy says there are some issues with SSIS 2019, so I'm just not a big fan of 2019. Nick, I'm going to mention too, because I saw your MacBook thing going, I wanted to mention, I always had really bad luck for the time capsule backups on hard drives, or like time machine backups on hard drives. I switched to one of the little Samsung 2.5-inch SSDs, and of course, I'm going to say this, and I'm sure that you know, the USB cable that you use is so important, because if you happen to get stuck with one that's on USB 2, you're utterly screwed. So I just went sure to make use one of the Thunderbolt cables and a really good USB 3 SSD. And that got me to the point where I can pull like half a terabyte back in 2 hours, I think it was. But the speed does suck on restoring, especially if you've had the backup going for like 6 months or a year. You can, in Time Machine's options, you can change it to redo a full one from scratch. All right, so let's see, next up, and Surly Dev must be in the house because he's doing a wonderful job already of queuing up all of the questions, and he's doing his My Friend Asks account, so a warm round of applause for Surly Dev, the moderator of this channel, who goes through and just does all kinds of heroic moderation stuff to line up your questions for these office hours. Shout out to Surly Dev. So let's see. G. Surgeon from Amsterdam says, or from the Netherlands says, when I rename a column, it's in the key or the include of a non-clustered index. That doesn't give me any problems. When the column to be renamed is part of the filter definition, SQL Server 2019 throws an error. Is this a reason, or is it weird, or is there a reason behind this behavior? So columns of an index, when you do the create index statement, all that SQL Server stores behind the scenes is the column ordinal, like is it column number 1, is it column number 4, or so forth. But when you do a filter, it actually needs to keep your T-SQL so that if it ever needs to be recompiled, like if something changes about the function that you're calling, so the text of that query that you write, where this equals that, actually has to be evaluated. Think of it as it's really just like an execution plan, whereas once an index has been created, it doesn't need to be repeatedly re-evaluated. So that's why that is. It's a neat question, though. I didn't know it before you said it, but like I'm just immediately knowing as soon as you said it, I'm like, oh, this is the way it has to be because it has to get evaluated each time. But I love that question. Yeah, it certainly does. It's so smart with that. That was really cool. Next up, my friend asks over on YouTube, what method would you recommend to migrate an instance to a new server? So I have this philosophy that you want to test before you go live. So whatever method I'm using for transferring the data or copying things from one place to another, it needs to be restartable. I don't want to use availability groups. I don't want to use an AG from one place to another. You technically can. You can do distributed availability groups to copy from one place to another. I'm not a fan. I'm a much bigger fan of log shipping because log shipping is just easier to break and restart than database mirroring or than database mirroring or availability groups. So huge fan of log shipping. If you need to copy things that aren't in the logs, like trace flag options, SP configure options, agent jobs, check out DBA tools. If you search for DBA tools, it's a PowerShell framework that Chrissy Lemaire and I want to say Rob Sewell were the original two starters of it. That was originally started just to do that, copy server contents from one instance to another. And they've really got that down to a science. It works really well. I say that not as somebody who uses it. I don't use it. I'm a consultant. I have a fake job. I don't really have to do a lot of work these days. I just stand around and tell other people what work to do. As Richie will probably tell you as well. Richie, go put out that fire. Conquer that hill. Take that hill. Next up, let's see here. What do we have next? Not the DBA you're looking for. Says, I have an execution plan that scans a clustered index and gets 1 row. The next operator does 4 rows. What are the additional 3 rows? Oh no, that's actually easy. That's a great question too. So when I build a parallel execution plan, let's go build one. Here, we'll do it on my VM. So I am going to use the Stack Overflow database, which just so happens that Nick Craver's in here too as well. I hate saying people's names because then they kind of jump. But so I have SQL Server and 2019 and the Stack Overflow database over here. I'm going to go write a query that's going to go parallel, and it's going to produce the symptom that you're looking for. So I'm going to say select you display name count star as posts from DBO users, where location equals India, order or I forgot to do a join, inner join. I also forgot to use a database. Use Stack Overflow, go. So let's go get from users inner join DBO post P on U ID equals who is U or P owner user ID group by U display name. So let's go find all of the people's display names. This isn't going to produce really technically useful answers. I'm just doing this just to prove a point. So I'm going to say, go find all of the people in India grouped together by name and how many questions or answers they've posted. And I'm doing that because it's a big country, so it goes parallel. So then, yeah, it's true, G-Surgeon. So now let's go see what this execution plan looks like. First, let's make sure that it actually gets the result that I'm looking for. It does. Oh, that's freaking awesome. Okay, so let's execute this. I don't expect this to finish right away. I expect this to take a minute. Oh, no, it did. It finished right away. Okay, beautiful. So now, let's look at this execution plan. I'm going to zoom in a little. When you see parallelism as an icon over there on the left, everything downstream went parallel, but it went parallel in a way that you might not have expected. Think of this execution plan as three-dimensional. There's a copy of this execution plan for every CPU core that I use. What I really have is I have 4 different cores that are each doing, move over a little bit more, 4 cores that are doing an index seek followed by an index scan. These are done 4 times. And if I hover my mouse over this, right click on it and go into properties, and if I go over into like IO statistics, I can see the number of reads that were done by each thread. So I can see that I have 4 different threads here that all did the work. 0 is a coordinating thread, he's a manager, but the other 4 threads all did work. In yours, what's happening is you have an index seek that looks like it was only done once, but it was actually done 4 times by 4 different threads. Each of those 4 threads seeked in, and they found the same row. But the reason why they did that is that it's going to end up becoming useful for them in other operations. The 4 threads each found their one row, and then they're going to go use it to go do other things. This is why when you're looking at the number of rows that come out of a parallelism operator, you don't usually want to look at the number of rows that are going in. You want to look more at the number of rows that are coming out, because that'll be a little bit more accurate, getting rid of the duplicates. Great question, though. I love that particular question. Let's see what we've got next. Next up, TG Yak on YouTube says, maybe this is the wrong place, but do you happen to know when you add the reporting services native feature, does that include the REST API? I have no idea. I actually don't know anything at all about reporting services, integration services, analysis services. They're all totally wildly different products that just happen to be thrown into the same box by Microsoft. When they want to charge you a lot of money for something, they put it in the SQL Server box because it's a very expensive box. But that's a great question to go ask over on Stack Exchange. If you go to dba.stackexchange.com, that's the kind of place where you can go ask them. Let's see here. Maulik says, how do transactions commit on active-active servers? SQL Server doesn't have a feature that's active-active other than transactional replication that's bidirectional. Like you can write to either server and they commit across. But otherwise, there's no such thing as active-active in SQL Server. When you hear active-active, it's by old people like me who are talking about a failover cluster that has multiple instances installed on it. A better name for that these days is called a multi-instance cluster, multi-instance failover cluster, multi-instance availability group, but you don't have 2 servers that are active for the same database at the same time for writes, unless you do bidirectional transactional replication. And if you do bidirectional transactional replication, you can write to either server. They don't talk to each other until their time to send the data across. You can break their network connection. They still keep write on accepting writes. And you have to deal with merge conflicts yourself. That is left as an exercise for the reader. Next up, Darius says, I have a very active transactional application with many inserts and updates. Just a side note, just generally to everybody in here, not just Darius, never use the terms large or very active or many or busy, because what seems busy to you may not actually be that busy to other people. It says, is it good practice to use for all read-only queries, especially reports, snapshot isolation transactions to omit problems with locking and deadlocking? So the gotcha there is that when you enable snapshot replication, what you're also doing is starting to hammer TempDB a little bit harder. Not every server can handle that, especially when you talk about very active and many. And I'm going to give you an example just because Stack Overflow. So at Stack Overflow, if they're doing 10, 50, 100,000 batch requests a second, they may not be able to afford to turn on snapshot isolation if some yo-yo starts a long-running report and fills up TempDB. So is it a best practice? I use it to solve problems, but I don't know that I would go turn it on and activate it unless I was comfortable with the workload first, because it can backfire. Your TempDB can fill up and transactions can slow down. Good question. I don't hear snapshot isolation and go, oh dear God, for the love of God, turn that off. You know, if it's working for you, you're fine. Not the DBA says, have you ever been called in to work on the real Stack Overflow DB? Yes, that I have. I used to be a consultant for them. They don't need me anymore because they're all super sharp people over there. But years ago, I did, and I loved it. There's absolutely wonderful and challenging. The way that I got started with it was Jeff Atwood posted a tweet one day, and he said, hey, I wish someone would make it easier to understand SQL Server execution plans. And I was like, ooh, because I followed Jeff and I always idolized him, thought he was amazing. And I was like, yeah, here, what can I do to help? And within like 15 minutes, I was sysadmin on their SQL server. And he was like, here's the deal. I got this query that runs in 50 milliseconds. I need it to run in like 15 to 20. I'm like, okay. Normally, oh, thank you. I appreciate that. But normally a lot of my clients are like, this query takes 50 minutes. We'd be happy if it ran in 15 minutes. Those are the easy ones. But when someone says, here, this runs in 50 milliseconds and we need it to run in 15 or 20, I'm like, you know, that's a whole lot. And it's more fun. I like that kind of challenge from time to time. Andy Leonard says, Surly Dev rocks. I agree. Absolutely. Wonderful character. Who I've met in person. And I guess I've met both of these people in person. I've met Andy Leonard and I have met Surly Dev. Apurur TV, I kind of like that name. That's kind of neato. Says unique index or composite primary key. That's an interesting question. Let me tell you where I would go to send you for more information. So for more information, there's a book. If I go to Amazon.com or wherever you prefer to buy your books, Lewis Davidson Relational Data Modeling. Lewis and Jessica Moss wrote this book, Pro SQL Server Relational Database Design. So that's by Lewis Davidson and Jessica Moss. And right now, there are only 16 left in stock. Remember that when you would buy books that were actually like in stock and stuff before you knew about clicking on this tab over here that said Kindle? Wow, you can even rent it. So this would be the place where I would go to learn more about that, just because if you're posting that, there's so many follow-up questions that I would want to ask, and I go, rather than spend 20 minutes on that, I'd rather point you towards a resource that will get you set for life, and that's a good example of that. All right, let's see here. Next up, DJ Collins says, very nice, CW Train. DJ Collins says, for new development projects, do you recommend using ADO and avoiding entity data model? I like it when developers use the tool that they're most comfortable with and that they're the best at using. You make the best music with the instrument you know how to use. You make the worst sounding music with the instrument you don't know how to use. So I don't really care what tool people use. I don't care if you use Hibernate, Dapper, OR, ADO.net, if you handcraft your own T-SQL, whatever when you know what you're doing, that's the one that I would recommend. DJ Khaled, yeah, because the last time I saw his name, or the first time that I saw his name over here in chat, I was like, he's DJ Khaled, because he asked another one. Oh, Nick says, okay, so this is Nick's opinion on the spectrum of, what's good or bad in terms of building stuff. Which one is he saying really, Brent, about? Is it DJ Khaled or what? Nick says, in SQL Server 2019, we are surprisingly seeing no table locking when adding columns to huge contentious tables, something that always happened previously at our scale. What changed at this front in 2019? So if you don't have a default value for it, it's been in Enterprise Edition, it's been lock-free for a while, but you still need a schema mod lock. Let me show you what I mean. So let's go back over here and start a new query over here on the Stack Overflow database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to need a schema stability lock in one window. For a schema stability lock, that means the table can't be changing. So let's write a query that does that. Select count star from DBO posts with index equals 0. And this is going to force SQL Server to scan the entire clustered index. The clustered index on this table is larger than I can fit in RAM. And I'm really going to screw with my SQL Server by knocking down the amount of memory that it has. So I'm going to give this thing just 1 gig of RAM. I know. So I'm going to give it just 1 gig of RAM, but I got to restart the SQL Server to do it, because if I try to drop it down to just 1 gig of RAM, while it's running, all hell will break loose. So let's restart it first. Then, after that finishes, good, he's done. I'm going to cut it down to 1 gig of memory, and then I'm going to restart it. I don't think I have a first setup job on here. Let me make sure that I don't have memory going on this thing. Perfect. Okay, good. He's down at like 3 gigs of RAM. So now when that select count star runs, he's going to take absolutely forever. So now in another window, I'm going to go add a column. Why am I looking there? And that's what I'm trying to do. New vertical tab group. So over on the left-hand side, that's going to be my query that goes off and runs. Right-hand side, I'm going to add a column. So I'm going to start by alter table DBO posts. For that, hit Google over there. I actually don't use Service Broker. Add column, or add Nick's opinion. Big int. There we go. All right. So let's try that. So I'm going to go 3, 2, 1, and when I hit execute on it, when nothing's happening on the server, you're going to notice that it happens instantaneously. 3, 2, 1, boom. Happens instantaneously, regardless of the size of the table. Now, however, let's go through and add Brent's opinion, but while I do that, over on the left-hand side, I'm going to run that select. And you know what else I'm going to do? I'm going to say with no lock, just to be really funny too. No lock. So now I'm going to do it with no lock, just so that it's supposedly not taking any locks, but it still takes the schema stability lock. 3, 2, 1, execute, execute. See how that's not adding now? What it's got to do is it has to wait for the query on the left-hand side to finish. That is the schema stability lock that it needs. This part has never changed. This part's always been that way, whether you had a default value for the column or not. So what's probably happening is that now you're seeing it go faster because you've tuned your queries so well that you just don't have to worry about that kind of thing anymore. All your queries are fast over on the left-hand side. Okay. So out of that one, we'll come back, and eventually that'll finish. Oh, here I'll hit the stop. 3, 2, 1. And when I hit the stop, you're going to notice they both finish. 3, 2, 1, stop. Boom. Happens instantaneously. You absolutely can. Absolutely. You can hit consulting on the top of my site, and it's I'm available for consulting there. Happens all the time. Next up Let's see what we got next here. Oh, my friend asks from over on YouTube, when should you not use in-memory OLTP if you care about not losing your data? And I don't just mean by the fact that it's in memory, because it can be durable. What I mean is that CheckDB doesn't work. Microsoft never implemented any kind of corruption checking except when they read the files from disk for in-memory OLTP. They read them at database startup and they read them at backup time. And when they find a problem with those files, your entire database goes offline. Not just the part with in-memory OLTP, the whole thing. So for me, if you care about the content, that's true. That's actually, that's true. Nick has a point there. It's over there. So it's kind of sketchy there in terms of quality. But there's some stuff, like I literally was working with a client this week who said, we're thinking about using in-memory OLTP for our staging environments. And I'm like, yeah, sure, by all means, at staging, you're going to restart the data warehouse nightly load process or real-time load process anyway whenever you run into a problem. So we don't really care about corruption as much in there. So we put I didn't tell them to do that, but you could put the staging stuff in a separate database so that if it blows chunks, it's just the staging database that goes offline. It's not the rest of your important databases. Mossy Moss over on YouTube asks, how can I convince the BI team that many of their queries can be done better when they don't understand things like joins, various UDFs, or block business critical operations? So when you need to get someone to do something, you have two options. You have the carrot and the stick. If you want to get a horse to go somewhere, you can either dangle a carrot in front of his nose, and that gets him excited. That's positive motivation. It gets him to move forward. Or you can stand behind him and beat him with a stick. That's negative motivation. He wants to move forward so that he stops getting his rear end hit with a stick. The problem with using negative motivation is that the horse will kick you in the nuts when you're not looking, even when you are looking. So if you want to get your business users to do something, it's clear by the tone of your question that you're using the stick. So you're trying to use the stick, that doesn't work. Just like they're probably trying to use a stick to get you to stop smoking weed at your desk during lunchtime hours. They have a webcam, they can see you. So what instead you want to do is dangle a carrot in front of them. You want to take one of their queries that sucks and you want to rewrite it. And you want to go, here, check this out. I took your query and I rewrote it, and here's how fast it runs now. It used to take 10 minutes, now it takes 10 seconds. Here are the things that I did to the query, and you can use these same techniques. Anytime you've got a query that's slow, use this as an example, as a starting point. If you know what you're doing, because they may not actually trust you, you may be over there going, stop using joins. Joins are bad. You may not actually know what you're doing, but by writing it out and proving that it's faster, that's true. By writing it out and proving that it's faster, then you're going to be able to show them the positive motivation. And they may go, oh, wow. So the next time I have a slow query, I'm going to try those tricks and I'm going to try to get them involved to see if they can make it go faster. It's also great for management. If management goes, man, these queries from business intelligence are just totally sucking, you can go, yep, I gave them a rewritten version of one of these queries. I showed them how to write it faster. If you want, you can sit with me and we'll have another one of those sessions. I'll rewrite one of their queries. But give them Andy Leonard says, a BI team should have a good DBA on a team. I agree. I should also have a Lamborghini and a Bentley, and Richie should be a billionaire by now, but if wishes were horses. Jesus from Nazareth says, hi, Brent. Could you suggest where my friend could learn? And I'm, of course, being, it's Jesus of Nazareth. I should say that especially, too, because Andy's in here. I don't want to seem disrespectful. I've been to Jerusalem. I've been to Israel. I absolutely love it. I like to think of myself as a recovering Catholic. I still struggle with all the guilt from childhood. It's never good enough. I'm trying to. Could you suggest where my friend could learn? And thanks again to Andy for the tip about Passion City, which is just a wonderful. I still love having that up in the background. Could you suggest where my friend could learn clustering from? He gets asked about it all the time during interviews. If someone gets asked about it all the time during interviews, so he wants to get a job doing something he's never done before, what you're essentially asking is, can he fake it? I wouldn't recommend faking it during interviews. What I would recommend instead is saying, I haven't used clustering before, but I would love to learn about it either on the fly or from a member of your team. Clustering tends to be used by people who need mission critical databases. You don't want to fake your way into mission critical. That can be just a little sketchy there. Now, if you want to learn about clustering, go to Amazon. There are a bunch of clustering books out there. Start with Windows clustering rather than SQL Server clustering, because SQL clustering is built on top of Windows clustering. So get your training wheels on with Windows clustering first, and everything you learn there will be directly applicable to SQL Server clustering too. Just make sure you stick with recent versions of Windows. This is true. This is absolutely true. 100%. And I think my query change was just one line long, if I remember right. Yeah, that's true too. Next up, Fahindra says, my disk file eating due to service broker error. How do I resolve service broker errors? Yeah, unfortunately, go to dba.stackexchange.com and post your question over there, just because I don't work with service broker at all. My friend asks, Angeline says over from on YouTube, how can I force users to filter their data? I have analysts pulling millions of rows, no where clause into Power BI. Asking nicely doesn't work, and working from home means I can't hurt them. So the thing with Power BI is it can actually be good to pull in all the raw data once and then use Power BI to filter it multiple times over time. There are lots of valid times when you actually need that. Now, though, I'm going to give you a bad answer. So it's time for the bad answers. What you could do is you could go into SQL Server, right-click on Properties, and I can never remember where this is, so we may have to dig a little bit here. There is a limit you can put in about how expensive queries are before they, I think it's that. Use query governor to prevent long-running queries. It could be that. There's another setting that you can shove in here that says if a query costs more than a certain amount, it won't be run. Let's see if that's it. Let's Google. So use query governor to prevent long-running queries. Let's see. SQL Server prevent long-running queries governor. Let's see if this does. Oh, yep, that's exactly what it is. Now, this is a spectacularly bad idea. It's a phenomenally bad idea because SQL Server will sometimes estimate a query's cost to be really high when it's actually not that hard. SQL Server may also think that a query is very cheap when it's actually very hard to do. But if you wanted to pull that kind of stunt, that would be one way to do it. I have never done that in production. I hope that I never actually do, but you asked, and so I like giving bad answers. Next up, let's see here. Are there any system inline table valued functions? Tell me more about the problem you're trying to solve. Like, ask about the problem you're trying to solve, because I'm not sure if we're like fishing for trivia here or what it is that we're trying to accomplish. There are many system functions that go inline kind of as views. Next up, Sumit. The MaxTop guidance has also changed from Microsoft. Should we change our existing systems as per the new recommendations? Change equals risk. Anytime you change something, you're running the risk that things can get worse. So what I often like to ask people, and you'll hear this all the time on my streams too, is what's the problem you're trying to solve? And then based on the problem, that's how you figure out what changes you need to make. If you're having a parallelism problem, then you'd be well to start with that. I teach you how to tell if you're having a parallelism problem during my mastering server tuning classes. Next up, Ariel says over on YouTube, hi Brent, I was wondering should I configure min server memory to 0? I always want to give you places to start to get those kinds of questions answered. Let's go see. So if you go to brentozar.com and up at the top, you click on scripts, If you click on scripts up at the top, there's my first responder kit, and I've got my SQL Server setup checklist inside there too as well. This gives you how I recommend setting up SQL Server, what changes you need to make. So that's the first responder kit over at brentozar.com. Now, having said that, should you touch min server memory? No, I'm not a big fan of that at all. It's not, every time that I've seen someone play around with it, they've been trying to stack multiple instances on the same SQL Server hardware, and that ends up causing you more problems than it solves. So I would leave that alone and not touch that. Next up, let's see here. Nicole says, huge fan, thank you, you're welcome. Any experience with using dockerized SQL Server 2019? Any thoughts on using it in production? It makes no sense in production. It makes perfect sense in development. If you want to test that your change scripts work as designed, what you could do is spin up a brand new database from a container with your current production schema and then apply your change scripts to it. But today in 2019, it makes no sense in production to the point where I'm struggling to keep this a family-friendly stream and not use swear words. I'm working on a little button for my Stream Deck that I can push where it'll make little beeping noises and put a cloud over my mouth as if I'm swearing. This would be one of those instances where I would use that. I get very angry at Microsoft when they say that Docker databases are ready for production. They are not. On other stacks, they are. On SQL Server, they are not. They make no sense. Big data clusters is different. Big data clusters isn't ready for production either. Nick says that's true. Nick says running 2019 on Docker VR MacBooks here. I just want to point out that the Stack Overflow is not running production on MacBooks. These are development instances which make perfect sense. I don't have any problems with those whatsoever. Bird song is better than bleeping. That's not so bad. Santa says, is there a situation you can think of for creating statistics on a table explicitly? Oh, that's really, yeah. It's true. Distributed. You could do it distributed. That's a really interesting question. I'm going to give you a couple of ones where it makes sense. Filtered statistics. I don't have a class on that to teach you when it makes sense to use. Kimberly Tripp does, though. If you're a Pluralsight subscriber, search for Kimberly Tripp Statistics, and I think she's got that course on Pluralsight. I have never hit the point where I needed it, but people who I respect have. So I'm like, filtered stats would be one. And then I'm going to give you one that people think they need and it doesn't really help, which is multi-column statistics. Multi-column statistics people think are going to somehow be magically smooth and deal with the playing cards scenario that I describe in my statistics video. If you haven't seen my playing cards video, go to YouTube and search for Brent Ozar Statistics, and I've got a demo where I explain statistics using playing cards, and I explain why multi-column stats don't really do anything. It's not that they don't do anything, they just don't help in real world problems. New Felona, no, they're completely irrelevant. That's why I'm trying to pivot as quickly as I can to becoming a streamer who plays Fortnite. Not really. Next up, The Hustler says, I like that spelling, that's pretty cool. The Hustler on YouTube says, does having large columns affect performance? How do I prove it? Oh yeah, it's really simple. So let's say I'm going to go over to my SQL Server. I should give it memory again. I kind of went a little bit on the small side in terms of memory. Let's go back to giving him a good chunk of RAM. I'm going to close a couple of windows and then go back to a really simple query. So in the Stack Overflow users table, the users table holds exactly what you think it holds, a list of everyone who's logged into Stack Overflow, left questions, posted answers, etc. There are several columns inside here. Display name, control up player, display name, location, website URL. But the one that I'm going to look at here is About Me. About Me is an nvarchar max. Santosh, it's that I'm not answering because I haven't gotten to your question, wherever the hell that is. So I respect that you think that you're the most important person in the world. But I've got bad news for you. It's only your mother that thinks so. And she's also lying. So if I say select top 1,000 about me from DBO users, order by reputation descending, let's drop indexes too so that there aren't any. So let's come down here to stack. I know, right? Aren't I a terrible person? So I'm going to get the top 1,000 about me ordered by reputation descending. And right now, I don't have an index on reputation. So what SQL Server is going to go do is it's going to go scan the entire users table and sort everyone by reputation. If I ask SQL Server how much data he thinks he's going to be dealing with, SQL Server, I always use a guy's voice for SQL Server because he's dumb and stubborn and refuses to ask for directions. He's all like, okay, all right, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to scan 9 million users, and then if I hover over here, Nick's making excuses for about me. I think that there's going to be 33 gigs worth of data that comes out of here. Really? SQL Server, you think there's 33 gigs worth of data in this table? Yeah. And in order to sort that 33 gigs worth of data, I'm going to need a lot of RAM. I really want a whole lot of RAM. In fact, I want 44 gigs worth of memory in order to sort this. So how much data is actually coming out of here? Let's go over and right-click on the users table, look at properties, and then look at the size of this table itself. This entire table is only 1 gig in size, just 1 gig. But SQL Server thinks that 33 gigs is going to be coming out of the table. Why? Well, the reason why is because when you define data types as large, SQL Server assumes that they're going to be half full. Santosh, shut up and wait. You're not first in line. You're going to be there. I will get there. Just hold your horses. And if you need to pee, go do it now, because I'm not going to get to your question right away. You have time to pee. You have time to let that out. I was going to say poop, but whatever. So the problem here, or Santosh, if it's really urgent, you can hire me for consulting by going to brentozar.com and clicking consulting up at the top. Operators are standing by. It's not free. There's a reason for that. So here, it's SQL Server estimated that it's 33 gigs because it believed half of your nvarchar maxes are actually full. So that's probably true too. So this is the penalty of using large data types. If you want to learn more about that, so Eric Darling, let's see, varchar, nvarchar, memory grant site, brentozar.com. Eric Darling wrote a blog post about that. Beautiful. There you go. So if you search for memory grants and data size on our site, there you go. So there you go. Let's see. Next up, let's go pop out of here and switch over to here. Next up, let's see here. Jan says, what's your opinion on containers like Docker for scaling? Not for SQL Server just yet. Doesn't make real sense for SQL Server just yet. Maybe in the future, but not just yet. They were supposed to have always-on availability groups inside containers for Kubernetes in 2019. They kept talking about that leading up to 2019, and then they pulled the feature at release time. So it's probably close, but it's not there yet. Loralee says, is there an easy way to capture index usage stats on a secondary in an AG? Because you can't read and write with the same connection. Yes, absolutely. With SP Blitz Index, I'll show you. So if I go open up SP Blitz Index, well, here, actually, we'll just go to the GitHub repo. So we'll go to firstresponderkit.org. Adam, you license by the host rather than the guest. So if I go to look at SP Blitz Index, actually, it's even in the README. So output database name. So what you do is you call spblitzindex with output database name, and you write it wherever you want to write it to. What I have here on the screen is spblitz, but the same exact thing works for spblitzindex. So what I would do is copy that out, paste it over here. You can write it on like a database administrator utilities database if you want. And then I'd also add get all databases equals 1, mode equals 2. So if you do this, and we'll call this blitz index results. So if you do this, oh, of course, that's spblitz index. This will get you exactly what you're looking for because it will dump the index usage data out into a table, and you can put it into any database or table that you want. So there you go. That was a nice way of me saying read the documentation. There you go. Let's see, next up, my friend from YouTube says, do you think SQL Server will be able to survive for more coming years as a company now that it's going to open source databases like MySQL? Remind me, when did MySQL come out?
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2,
it's been a little while, right? It's not like it's new. And I don't know about you, but I seem to be doing okay financially. So in theory, open source databases should continue to get better and better, like MySQL, Postgres, exactly. Yeah, compared to like old people like me and Nick, it's brand new. So open source databases will continue to get better and better, just like Linux got better and better as an operating system. But at the same time, companies like Microsoft, Oracle, IBM, they know that they need to get better if they're going to preserve their revenue streams. The last time that Microsoft talked about it publicly, SQL Server was $1 billion a year business. If you were making $1 billion a year and somebody else started doing your job for free, you would start putting work into that, protecting your assets, because you want to make sure that you keep making $1 billion a year. And fortunately, that's what Microsoft has been doing. They've been continuing to improve the product, which is kind of awesome. VTOL Freak has a really good point in that we run into that with, at our company, we use Postgres, Amazon Aurora Postgres on our back end. Sounded a little dirty when I said it that way. And that's a great example of it. The database platform may be free and the hosting might be cheap, but the support is sure as hell not. Joseph says over on YouTube, is SQL Hierarchy optimized to use in queries? It appears to be CLR. It behaves like a UDF function. Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's fast, and I don't think that it's been improved in 10 years, maybe 15 years since it came out. So it wouldn't be something that I would implement in new development today. I'm not saying you have to rip it out of existing development. I just wouldn't implement it in new development today. Xavier says, we have some instability issues hanging the SQL Server instance in insufficient memory. Might our resource manager configuration be causing it? Yes. Oh, you wanted me to fix it on a live stream. Oh no, that's kind of tough. There are so many things that could be causing it. The first thing that I usually just go is, have you got more memory on the SQL Server than you do on your laptop? Like most of us have 16, 32, 64 gigs of RAM on our 16 or 32 gigs of RAM on our laptops these days. If your laptop has more memory than the SQL Server, that's the first place I just go start as a sanity check. But then absolutely configuration can be causing it. I am an angry gumball. That is awesome. I love that. That's great. I'm an angry gumball asks, Brent, have you ever had a situation, we can probably stop there because the answer is probably yes, where production data was simply too much to get the desired performance and archiving was the solution? Oh, this is a great question. Whenever you manage SQL Server performance, you have 3 dials. I've always called them knobs, but I'm trying not to do that because I have a British audience and knobs means something different. You have 3 dials to tune performance. You have the hardware dial, the table dial, and the query dial. You can add more hardware, you can change your table designs or what you store in them, or you can change the way that you query them. There have been situations where people have said, they've kind of tied my hands behind my back and they've said, you can't buy any more hardware here, like it's a cloud solution and they charge by the hour, by the month for performance. We can't buy any more hardware and we can't change the queries. Then in those cases, archiving has been a solution. But normally, as a consultant, I got to get a fix in 48 hours. So like my SQL Critical Care, I have 2 days, thanks. I have 2 days to turn a server around from 0 to hero. Often I can't say, well, what you should do is implement archiving, because it's going to take months for people to do it, because users expect to be able to query all their data through time. It sounds like you're asking this because you want your users to archive. What you might do is talk to your security and compliance departments, because for some companies, there's actually a legal risk to keeping old data around. But just like if we're talking less than a terabyte, no. I mean, for situations where I've had that discussion, it's been over a terabyte of data. Next up, Nerdophile says, are graph databases ready for production purposes? I would ask it the other way. I would say, are people using graph databases in production? If so, they're ready for production purposes. You go to war with the database you have, not the database that you want. I'm an angry gumball says, I want our response to bad performance, not default to archiving on a 100 gig database. So this is 128 gigabytes. It's probably going to be hard to get the camera to focus on it because it's so damn small and cheap. If I had a hammer right now, I would smash this on my desk just to show you that this is kind of disposable. It's not like 128 gigs is big data. It's just not. So if you can't make that pig fly at 100 gigs, go start reading training manuals. It's a little easier for that. My friend asks over on YouTube, I know, right? That's my goal, is like try to riff as fast as I can. Yeah, Andy's got a point, but the problem is that just reading data out of the archives, because everybody's like, well, I need to be able to read data out of the archives whenever I want, and I don't want to change any of my reports. And I'm like, well, that doesn't work. I don't know why I channeled Ed from 90 Day Fiance there. Grodchum asks over on YouTube, what do you think about Polybase? Is it a good option to connect to CSV files? Absolutely. If you like spending $7,000 a CPU core in order to query CSV files, Polybase is a great answer. Right. Next up, Angeline says, have you ever experienced an issue where SQL jobs request the OS to do something and it doesn't send acknowledgement back, so SQL just sits there waiting? My thing is that SQL Server is like the world's most expensive OS scheduler. I don't want SQL Server telling individual operating system commands what to do. That just doesn't, it seems so backwards to me. Why spend $2,000 to $7,000 a core for SQL Server to do something? If you want to have a job request the OS to do something, just go build an app server. Have a C# app, go poll and do that. Yeah, it's true. But so I haven't done that because usually if clients come to me with how do we get SQL Server agent to call the OS to automate things, I'm like, you don't. That's what developers are for. Developers are good at building tools like that. It's a good valid question. It's a valid question. It's why just like people are like, what's the best way to use a hammer to paint a picture? You know, should I put it in the red paint first or put it in the blue paint? I'm like, you don't use hammers to paint pictures. You use paintbrushes. It's a different thing. She says like restores. So I wouldn't initiate restores from a SQL Server agent job. That's something that I would do outside with like a PowerShell script and Windows Task Scheduler, because your error handling will be so much more robust. Next up, and we'll do this one and then we'll go take a bio break and then we'll come back. Lelouch says, in your experience, is there a difference in tuning on-premises and an infrastructure as in a service environment? What should I be careful of? Yes, the huge difference. Well, okay, so there are two massive differences. One is the cost. You can get a cost cut if you tune infrastructure as a service because you cut your bill the next day. So managers love that. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. But the other huge difference is in infrastructure as a service, you have two I/O limitations. You have one I/O limitation at the VM level. Each VM instance type has different amounts of throughput that it can get to storage. Then you also have the storage throughput limit. The best way to explain that is a website. I'll show you. So if I go open up a browser and I go to ec2instances.info, ec2instances.info is a site where you can go and compare and contrast the different Amazon instance types. There's also one for Azure and one for Google Compute Engine too as well. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the columns drop down so that I can choose what kind of throughput I get. Now we'll put each of these in here. Oops, move out. So now in here, each VM type has how fast the network is, how fast the storage bandwidth is, and its theoretical max throughput. So notice that these are wildly different. I mean, just all over the place. 62, 1700. The VM type that you choose has different storage bandwidth. I've seen so many times where someone's come to me and like, Brent, I don't understand why our storage is so slow. I'm spending $10,000 a month on drives. And then we go look at their instance type and it's trying to suck through a giant big gulp of soda from the 7-Eleven, and they have a real tiny straw. You want a really big straw? It's going to get dark really quickly. So what you want to do is find an instance type with a really big straw. This is a great example of how tuning is so different in infrastructure as a service. So a brief shout out to this week's sponsor. If you've been thinking about playing around with column store indexes, go check out columnscore.com, where they have a 7-question quiz that will tell you whether or not your tables are a good fit for column store indexes or not. So that's over at columnscore.com. So what we'll do is we'll take a 5-minute bio break. I will go refuel my espresso, and you can go to the loo. Maybe, though some of you who are getting a little antsy about your question not being answered yet, maybe you could go smoke some weed or something, calm down, take a downer. And then we will come back and go through the rest of the questions in the queue. So good, Alexander likes Column Store. Thanks, glad you like it. So I will take a 5-minute bio break, and then we'll be right back. 5 minutes, go. All right, let's see here. Welcome back, folks. It's always funny. I always make espresso and then I never actually drink it fast enough when it's warm. It's kind of crazy. B Squid's coming to San Diego. It's absolutely gorgeous out. Great weather. It was hot like 2 weeks ago, but now it's back to normal. I wear a hoodie type thing all the time on streams, but it's because we keep the house so cold. My wife and I like to sleep completely covered in blankets, which is odd because she's from El Salvador. But so we like sleeping totally under blankets. So we end up keeping the house at like 64, 65, 66 overnight, Fahrenheit, obviously. So, all right, next up, let's see here. Ralph says from over on YouTube, what are the use cases for having multiple availability group listeners? Oh, a friend of mine just blogged about this. A friend of mine just recently blogged about this. I'll show you. So if you go to am2.co, am2.co is Andy Mallon, and he has a blog post on multi-subnet availability group that works with like JTDS, open source database connection drivers, blah, 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 blah. You can read about that over at am2.co and read his most recent 2 posts on multi-subnet availability groups. And to make those work, you want multiple listeners. So there you go, am2.co. Next up. Let's see. Angeline says, I'm such a big fan. My girlfriend actually Googled you to see if she could have anything you could give me for my birthday. If you, on my Twitch channel, so you're on YouTube, but if you search for Brent Ozar Twitch, and they're on my Twitch channel, at the bottom, there's actually t-shirts, hoodies, coffee cups, all that kind of stuff with our company logo on it. So that's kind of cool. Hi, Elgetty. Good to see you. Next up, Jarrett says, can I see when a DML is doing a full table lock or just a row lock? Yes, with Atom Mechanics SP Who is Active. I'll show it to you. So if you want to see what kinds of locks something has, you run SP Who is Active get locks equals 1. Let's move things around a little bit just so that I can show it. Let's move this over here. So I'm going to zoom in. Over on the left-hand side, I'm going to run SP Who is Active with get locks equals 1. If you Google for that, it's totally open source and free, and it's available on GitHub. Then over on the right-hand side, I'm going to start a transaction, begin tran, update DBO users, set reputation equals 1 million, where display name equals Joris. So we're going to give Richie 1 million reputation points. I'm going to hit execute that on that over on the right-hand side. You would normally never do a... Yes, exactly. If I can, I will. On the left-hand side, I'll run SP Who is Active. Now, on the left-hand side, then, I'm going to be able to see what locks that session holds. Over on the right-hand side here, there's a new locks column in SP Who is Active. If you run it with get locks equals 1, click on that, and then it'll show you what kind of locks are open. In here, there's just an exclusive lock on that object, which means it's a table level lock. X means exclusive, IX means intent exclusive. But if you see exclusive across the entire object, that's a table level lock. So SP Who is Active get locks equals 1, super useful. Should I commit that or should I roll it back? I'll give you all time to decide. Should I commit or roll it back? Let's see here.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5,
Survey says
3, 2, 1.
Doesn't look like enough people say I should do it. So roll back it is. Roll back and off he goes. Go negative. I like that. That's good. Adam says, when do you feel the need to spin up additional databases in production when licenses cost $7,000 a core? Well, $7,000 a core is for the server. But on that server, you can run as many databases as you want. So the times when I open up a good point, good one, G Surgeon. When I create additional databases is when I may need to have a different recovery time for that stuff. Like if someone is doing XML logging, if they're just dumping XML into a table in order to save it for something, I'll often put that in a totally separate database of junk that I'll only back up once a day, if that. Whereas some of my other stuff, I may need to make highly available, put it inside of an availability group, stuff like that. Let's see here. Next up, Junior DBA says, a friend got handed SQL Server 2017 with Polybase and scale-out groups. What are good resources to learn more about managing and troubleshooting Polybase? Unfortunately, you're just going to have to hit Amazon. You're going to have to hit Amazon and go get books. There were a couple of people who work for Microsoft who wrote books on it. When Microsoft brings out a new feature, like SQL Server on Linux, for example, they'll pay their own employees to write books on it because they got to get word out. They got to get education out to people as to how they use it. Ain't nobody's a strong word. Very few people are going to do that out in the real world, so you're not going to find a lot of good community resources on that, unfortunately. Next up, we have CTI Geek says, if I read large amounts of data from the read-only node of an availability group, will that present locks on the same table in the active node? No. So what can happen is people on the active node may be trying to change the table structure. Like they may be trying to add columns or change indexes. So you can absolutely have scenarios where read-only queries on the secondary prevent things from happening on the primary. In addition, if it's a synchronous secondary, if every write on the primary has to be committed at the same time on the sync secondary, the more work you add to that sync secondary, the more you're going to slow down things in production. So generally, I'll tell my clients that if you're going to use a reporting replica, and it's fine if you do, if you're going to use a reporting replica, it should be async, and you want to start being really careful about when you do deployments that would change the table structure on the primary. Next up, let's see. Nick says, a disclaimer, about me and about me raw are in another table in production now. We kept it in the same table in the data dump, not to host Brent's demos. Love you, mean it. But yeah, tags is another one where I got to start putting tags in a separate table now to be more accurate to what happens, which isn't even, you know where I'm going with that. Next up, oh, we already answered that one, so I'll delete that one. Let's see, next up. Adam says, how would you handle licensing in a scenario where you spin up servers left and right? You license VMware at the host level, and then you can run unlimited guests. So that just makes it easier. And Hyper-V, you can license Hyper-V at the host level. It's just not as many people use Hyper-V as they do VMware. B-Squid says, any recommended resources on learning about availability groups and when it's good or bad? So there was one community member who was going to write a book on them, and he never did. So right now you're really just kind of stuck with reading the documentation or what you can find on Amazon. The problem with availability groups is that Microsoft keeps changing them so quickly that it doesn't pay to write the documentation. Like if I sat and wrote all kinds of training, because I used to do training on availability groups, if I wrote all kinds of training on availability groups like Kermit at the typewriter, 1 year later, the time when Microsoft released the next version, I would have to go through and redo all that training material, and I couldn't sell enough training fast enough to make that profitable, and everybody else in the community seems to be faced with that same trouble. So because it's not profitable, the only place where you can go to find good info on it then would be the place that can afford to lose money on it, which would be Microsoft. They can afford to lose money on that stuff. Gary Bargsley over on YouTube asks, is there a good way to explain to the client that the application is causing the slowness and not SQL Server? Yes, it's beyond what I can explain fast in here, though. I actually have a whole class on that. That's the Mastering Server Tuning class, and I can't remember if you've been in there or not, but I would go through the modules in the Mastering Server Tuning class where I explain how to get to the root cause of it. The reason why I say that is that your question has another layer to it. It isn't just the speed of the app, it's also the application code. And so depending on if you mean the applications like CPU or network throughput or whatever versus the wait types caused by crappy code, all that's explained in the Mastering Server Tuning class, so I would head over there. Next up, Santosh, this is the one who asked it like twice. Santosh said, how about performance on a replication database? How about it? How about it? That's fantastic. Oh, that was a question. We're having very long running queries for a simple select. So if you want to troubleshoot slow queries, what you want to do is get the execution plan. If you get the execution plan, and here I'll show you here. So if you search for Brent Ozar get help slow query, if you search for Brent Ozar get help slow query, I've got a blog post in here that walks you through exactly what you do. You gather the actual, not the estimated, but the actual execution plan, and then you post that on Stack Exchange along with a link to it, so then that way those of us in the community can go troubleshoot it. Because, dude, there are so many reasons why a query could be slow. That's why I make a really good living doing training classes on how to interpret that kind of thing. But start there because it's totally free. I would always rather you get help totally for free. So I have how to get help with a slow server, and then, or how to get help with a slow server, and then how to get help with a slow query too as well. Next up, Ian says, I have a query that takes around 6 seconds to run. Adding an order by call causes this to raise to several minutes. What things should I be looking for? Okay, remember a long time ago, long time ago, you had a phone book. The phone book, the phone company would bring, not all of you are this old, but me and Ian. Company would bring a phone book to you, and it would have everyone listed by last name, first name. If I said, Ian, I want you to read me out the contents of the phone book ordered by last name, you would open up the book and you would start yelling answers back to me faster than I could even keep up. But if, on the other hand, I said, Ian, I want you to read them out ordered by first name, you would be looking for a broomstick to whack me across the, or baseball bat, whatever. Because what would you have to do? You would have to read out that phone book and write it down, write all those people out ordered by first name before you could even give me the first result. What would you need in a case like that? You would need an index. You would need an alternative copy of the phone book that's sorted by the way that you need that data. But that's also why I would say, you know what? You got to stop asking SQL Server to order the stuff for you. If you want stuff ordered, that's what an application server is for. SQL Server has to work very hard to sort stuff, and SQL Server is licensed at $2,000 a core for Standard Edition, $7,000 a core for Enterprise Edition. Application servers cost $0 per core. So I would rather do my sorting over on the application server, which is free. So go get that data out and go. Not counting for discounts. Adam has a tendency to steal his licenses off the back of a truck, so he gets a different discount than the rest of us get. Next up, Gaunt Realities over on YouTube says, what if Stack Overflow database is too large for me to install at a SQL Express instance? What can I do? Oh, you know what? Oh, I was going to jump to something else, but just go get the Developer Edition. SQL Server Developer Edition is completely free. But you also don't have to get the really big one. Get the small instance of Stack Overflow. I ship a small, medium, and large one. Go get the small one that's as of 2010. DB says, DB says on YouTube, can you talk about when to use heaps in reporting with lots of ETL? Oh, I can. If you search for Microsoft Fast Track Data Warehouse Reference Architecture. So this is how Microsoft recommends that used to recommend that you build data warehouses. I don't know that they do that as much anymore with the advent of column store indexes, but this is the way that people got started building data warehouses and doing heaps. So that's the place to go Google from. There's a space inside there. I missed a space. Not that it matters. Google is so smart. He figures it out. It's just amazing. So go Google that, and off you go. Documentation on it is fantastic, by the way. I'm just kind of saying it quickly as if it's a web page. There's like 200 pages worth of documentation there that will explain why heaps make sense. Next up, we have Oh, Ernesto says, where can I find an explanation of every icon used in execution plans and the meaning of each one? SQLServerFast.com. And oh, I can't type it in from there. Oh, I can over here, though. Hold on, let me do that. So SQLServerFast.com. Let's see if that actually goes in. Probably won't go into the chat. Let me do it a different way. So SQL. Oh, there we go. G-Surgeon nails it from the Netherlands. I don't know why I always have to say the Netherlands, but it's almost like I'm your advertising. Please see G-Surgeon in the Netherlands. But Hugo Cornelis has a listing of every operator and what they mean, so it's kind of cool. And it's totally free. Also sells video training too. Misclassification, which I love that name too. I have a 10 billion row table that contains varchar max, hence I cannot create a clustered column store on it. What would be the smartest solution to improve query performance on that table? Me personally, I would separate the varchar max to a different table, and immediately you're like, Brent, I can't do that. Hold on, hold that thought. What if you take all the stuff that makes sense for clustered column store, you put that in one table, you take the varchar max, you put that in a different table, then, so you call that maybe table 1 and table 2. Then whatever the table name used to be before, you create a view that joins between those two tables. That way, when people only want stuff from the column store index, it's blazing fast. When they ask for the varchar max, you're going to get bigger memory grants and all that. But as long as you do it as a left outer join, so they only get the rows from the varchar max table when they need them, make a huge difference in your indexing strategies, your memory grants, all of that good stuff. You can insert into a view. You can put triggers on a view. So it's not as hard as you might think. Normally, of course, changing table structures is kind of dangerous, but that view trick may be what you're looking for. And I say that because it's probably the solution that sucks the worst. It was a dark and terrible winter. Ashish, I think you've sent this in a couple of times. Hold on, hold on to your pants there. We got a few questions that are coming in. Next time, maybe you try getting here on time. Kevin says, what are some of the database development anti-patterns that you've seen that you wish we weren't doing? Reading the ever-loving documentation. My God, look, people, I know that you can get in a car and you can turn the key and you think you know how to drive. And that works when you're just following basic rules and you need to get from A to B, when you need to get from your house to the store. But if you're going to drive in a race, if you're going to be paid to drive for a living, if you're going to get paid to drive for a living, you should start to read the manual. You should understand how the damn thing works. And I know people who are like, oh no, trust me, I could totally drive this car in a race. Why is everyone passing me? What is an engine? How do brakes work? If you read up about how like Formula One car drivers work, they work hard to understand the mechanics of cars, the physics of cars, how you approach corners, how they can work with their engineers to build a better car. They're not just getting behind there going, hold my beer and start driving. So that's the thing that I wish more people would do, is understand how to use the tools, instead of so many of my clients come to me and they're like, why is this thing on fire? Where is the smoke coming from? And I'm like, dude, you can't drag a baby carriage behind the car while you drive. That's just not, it shouldn't even be legal. B Squid says, I knew I loved Brent's resources, but who knew I'd fall in love with his streams too? Woohoo! Next up, Contact Administrator. Good to see you again, Administrator. A query in production is using multiple threads through data in tables that are very small. What's causing this query to use multiple threads when there are joins and functions used in this query? So the more work that SQL Server thinks that it has to do, the more likely it is to throw multiple cores at it. To learn more about why, go to brentozar.com/go/cxpacket, And I'll zoom in on that one so that you can see it. brentozar.com/go/cxpacket. That's a totally free blog post that I've got out there. And you can learn much more about parallelism in all of my classes. I cover it in mastering index tuning, mastering query tuning, mastering server tuning, in gradually harder increments. But this is the first place to go on your journey to understand why SQL Server parallelizes stuff, even when you think it may not really be that expensive. A couple of you had asked questions too around what you should set cost threshold to or max DOP. That's also covered in this post as well. brentozar.com/go/cxpacket. Next up. Adam says, why not use partitioning to improve performance? I'll leave you to search on that one in our blog. If you go to brentozar.com and search for partitioning, we've got blog posts with examples in there showing you how it can make queries slower instead of faster. Jarrett says, are you going to post this video on YouTube? Yes. All my stuff, as long as it's not a private training class, I end up leaving the archives on YouTube and Twitch as long as they do as well. Next up, let's see. Harsha says, in a VM world, where do I change the power management settings? Everywhere. You set them everywhere. And that it sounds like I'm being sarcastic, but the thing is that your hardware, the virtualization layer, and the operating system can each override things. The hardware is the final boss. The operating system at the host layer is the next boss. So you got to make sure that those bosses agree. Next up, let's see here. Pradeep says, how do I optimize a stored procedure which loads the data from JSON? Generally, this is just me, but generally speaking, if I'm going to do any kind of JSON manipulation, I actually wouldn't do it in a stored procedure. Because SQL Server is kind of expensive in terms of CPU, I would do that parsing in C# or Java, whatever your favorite development language is. I would do it over there before I would do it in SQL Server, just because SQL Server is expensive. This is why you get different answers from me than you do from Microsoft, because Microsoft will tell you, you can manipulate JSON and SQL Server. Also, we let you run Java code, Python, and R all inside the database files. Want to store them in here? We've got your MP3 collection covered. Videos, put them right inside the box. SQL Server, it's all here for you. When in reality, they're charging you $2,000 a core for standard, $7,000 a core for enterprise. I don't want to use that expensive storage box unless I can absolutely not avoid it. G-search it. I know, right? There we go. Nicolaj says, after investigating SQL Server where performance is an issue and you find the queries that are causing issues, but client insists you look elsewhere, how do you go about that? Oh, it's a great question. So remember how I said earlier in the stream, and you might not have been here, but I have three dials. I have the hardware dial, the query dial, and the index dial. I'm sorry, the hardware dial, the query dial, and the table dial, because sometimes tables aren't just about indexing. I never want to say it's blank's fault, like it's the query's fault because the queries suck. What I do like to say is, though, okay, given these queries, what knobs can I tune? I can turn the query knob to rewrite the queries. I can tune the hardware knob to throw more hardware at it, or I can throw the table design knob to better store the indexes in order to handle those queries. And I like giving those options to the client. The way that I ask it is, I got these three knobs. See, I told you I was trying to stop using the term knob, and here I am doing it again. I got these three dials that I would turn. Which dial are you comfortable turning? And I'm fine with, if you want to tie my hands and say I'm not allowed to turn certain dials, I'm completely fine with it. I'm comfortable doing it the other way instead. But just whichever way you want me to turn, but you have to choose the one that you would be the most likely to turn. Because I don't want to be like, your queries are terrible. You got to do something about that. You should rewrite them. Because often the queries just can't be rewritten. We don't have enough developers. There's too much risk in changing the queries. Good developers are hard to find. That's why I had to settle for Richie. But so that's why I just try to give them as many choices as I can and say, which one would you like to do? Okay, let's go down that route instead. Alexander Fleming says, what's the best way to prove that no lock is the cause of a data quality error? Search for Brentozar and no lock, and you'll see video demos on it, and then show that to your coworkers who are wondering if no lock is fair. Why no lock is a bad idea. Santa says, what's your opinion on moving an OLTP database, 1.5 terabytes, that's on EC2 over to RDS in terms of performance? Well, so EC2 and RDS have different instance types available. If you're happy with one specific instance type in EC2, see if the same instance type is available in RDS. If it is, then at least a standalone instance would be okay. But if you want high availability, then Amazon's also going to have you go to synchronous mirroring or synchronous availability groups. For that, you could try experimenting with putting in sync mirroring or sync availability group in your EC2 and see how the performance goes. But it's not like RDS is fundamentally different than EC2. It's the same thing. So you just have less choices in terms of what your HA and DR options are. Next up, SQL Emmanuel says, let's say that there's a data warehouse instance in a virtual machine where BI queries are updating hundreds of millions of rows. This is more RAM. Okay, so can I tell you what's better for your server, RAM or storage? No. That's where the consulting comes in, realistically. Next up, Adam says, but what would be the benefit of spinning up additional instances for scaling rather than running the biggest way? Okay, so Adam, I get that you're trying to ask a big, long, multi-part question. I think that this is kind of outside of the fit of something we can do quickly. I'd probably want to see the advice on your server that you're trying to solve. Because either it sounds like you're trying to ask a hypothetical what-if question, and there are just all kinds of answers. It's tough to really hit right quickly. Or if you have a detailed question about your architecture and scale up versus scale out, you wouldn't want someone's free advice from a Twitch stream. Like, that's where the consulting stuff comes in. Because that's like $1 million question, right? You could easily blow $1 million going down the wrong route there. Nick says, tip for, oh, that's absolutely true. Like MVC Mini Profiler. I absolutely love that. That's fantastic. I say that, it's not like I have to code it, but for if you want to learn more about that, I'll show it up on the screen. So if you search for MVC Mini Profiler, this is really cool. It lets you inject a little timer into your web page so you can see like everything that's happened during the rendering of that web page, not only just in IIS, but also in like calls that you make off to SQL Server, what the query was, how long it took SQL Server to respond, and much more. It's really cool, just really super slick. Next up, let's see here. Surly Dev says, just a note to question askers, if you keep asking your question, then I'm going to remove it from the queue and re-add it at the end. Also, too, I'll tell folks, don't post any more questions now. What I'll do is I'll work through the rest of the queue. I may not even get through the whole entire queue, but at 8 o'clock, I am going downstairs because the coffee shop down below me opens up and they have lox and bagel that I like very much, and it's my weekend. I have a 5-day weekend. I was basically off yesterday. I had a short part with like 4 hours with a client in the morning, but then now I can go get drunk today, tomorrow, Monday, and Tuesday. Yes! Oh, it's fantastic. I needed that. I mean, I didn't really need it, but it's always nice to have. Mossy Moss says, oh, you're welcome. Says, I think I'll speak on behalf of everyone. I appreciate you sharing your time and experience with us, regardless of where we are in our career. Each of us learns a lot from you. You're welcome. That's true too. Not the DBA you're looking for. That's my whole goal, is to make it suck less for people who are coming up on their way than it was for me. When I was coming up, all I had to do was read boring books, and I was just bored out of my mind trying to learn SQL Server. So I'm like, what can I do that brings more personality into it and have more fun? Bob, it's good to hear that you're doing better too as well. Next up, Brian asks from over on YouTube. Brian says, can I make temporal tables to do an application? Can I use temporal tables to make an application think that there's only 1 year of data when in actual... Oh! I wouldn't do that. Here's what I would do in your case. Here's what I would do, is do a view. Have people query the view, not the tables. Take the table and rename it as like table underscore source and put a view in its place that's just called table. And then in the view, filter out the old data. Say just where the date is within the last year. Now you're going to need indexes to support that. You just by doing the query filter alone in the view doesn't mean that it's going to stop the query from doing a table scan. Because if there's no index on that date column that you're using for the filter, you'll still end up scanning them to find the rows. But that would be the trick that I would use rather than temporal tables. Deb29 says, do you have any place that I can start with learning about normalizing my database? I'm going to start a new application and I want the database to be optimized from the start. Yes, read the book, SQL Server Relational, typing it out, Data Modeling by Lewis Davidson. I'm putting that over in chat just so that, and it's probably not working. Wash your hands sense. Let me go put it over in the chat in Twitch just so that it shows up there. SQL Server Relational Data Modeling by Lewis Davidson. And I put left the D out of Davidson, but there you go. That's the book that you can use in order to conquer that topic. Let's see here. Next up, Ashish says, we have one database that's 600,000 gigabytes. 600, I don't know if that means 600 gigabytes. There are a few apps that insert 10 to 20, 30, many apps, it'll make a difference. No. So 10 to 20,000 inserts a minute isn't a lot. 10 to 20,000 inserts a minute really isn't that big of a deal. So if you break it out per second, so let's even take the high side of that, 30,000 inserts per minute, divide that by 60, that's only 500 inserts per second. That's really easy. To give you a rough idea, I have queries that do, or I have clients that do 50 to 100,000 inserts per second, sustained for hours at a time. So I wouldn't change any data structures in order to accomplish that. It's just not that large. I meant to say second. Okay, so I tell you what, it sounds like you've changed this a few times. Go ahead and hit me for consulting up at the top of brentozar.com and we'll go from there. Next up, a good one says, hi Brent, in the case where different database max stops have been set and multi-database joins, who sets the max stop? The max stop in which your query runs. If your query runs in database A, whatever database A's max stop is, that's what max stop you inherit. And of course, there are things like resource governor that can affect that at the server level too as well. But if you're just talking about databases with the database level set, it's whatever database you run your query in, which can be totally irrelevant to your multi-database queries too. Next up, what the what? Adam says, let me show this. To be fair, SAP didn't support joins until a few ways ago. I don't think that that's true, but I'm gonna just hide that. I should have read that before let me go close that and close. Kashif says, we're having a huge preemptive OS auth wait type. Any suggestions on how to reduce them? So normally the only time that you see that wait type is when there's a lot of logging in happening. That makes me think that we're probably not using connection pooling. So make sure that connection pooling is turned on at the application layer and that you're reusing connections. The place where I've seen this happen is where people tried to architect a yep, that's exactly it. Where I've seen and I don't know what edition number it is, where I've seen people try to architect it is they try to run a query based on whoever the user was. That's true too. It can also happen if SPNs are having problems. And if you want to learn more about SPN problems, I'll give you if you go to my bookmarks, so my bookmarks are publicly open there. If you go over to pinboard.in/u:/Brento, you actually see my live blog posts or my live bookmarks as I look for stuff. So if you search inside my bookmarks for SPN, I actually have a couple of great things that I've saved from a couple years ago about troubleshooting those. So you can search for those over at pinboard.in. All right, next up, let's see here. Next up, oh, Gary asked from over on YouTube, how did you come up with, yeah, no, that's absolutely never happening in COVID days. That is absolutely not happening. Gary says, how did you come up with SP Blitz as your script naming? This is like more than 10 years ago when I first started sharing that script. Before it was a stored procedure, I called it my Blitz script because there's this term about blitz in wars where you blitz the enemy, and it's also in football where you have a blitz play where you massively throw a lot of defensive resources at your opponent. What I wanted to do was very quickly overwhelm a SQL Server with diagnostic queries and ask all kinds of things to find out, really interrogate everything quickly just in one report. So that's where Blitz came from. If I had it to do back over again, would I use the same branding? I think I would. There have been a couple times where people said, I find it offensive because it has war connotations. And that's fair, but I don't think that you can do anything without offending somebody. Sooner or later, just somebody's going to take offense to something that you do. Pineapple on pizza? What? You know, something like that. MS SQL Server DBA says, how do I tune for ad hoc queries with 1,000 columns that isn't normalized and is also used for OLTP? Most columns are null. So that 1,000 columns strikes me as a little bit wrong. Like, so someone made a design decision there. And unfortunately, it's kind of like saying, how do I get a pig to fly? You load them on airplanes, but the pigs can't fly by themselves. You don't do OLTP with an 1,000 column table. It's not going to work. So the pain that you're feeling is real pain, and there's great news. There's never been a better time to get another job. So there's always that. Next up, my Gab says, it's a sparse matrix, yeah. Gab says, my management wants a secondary SQL Server replica at the DR site with automated failover and read-write capabilities on the secondary. I don't think there's a feasible way to do this. Am I wrong? Your management wants that. There are two major problems with that. It is doable with bidirectional transactional replication. So bidirectional transactional replication lets you write in two places at the same time, and if you have a network split, it still works. You have to deal with the conflicts whenever they see each other again, but it's technically doable. So the thing with a secondary with automatic failover onto DR, that means that every time you have a network blip in between those two, DR would take over. And when I explain that to management, like, look, you realize that if you lose your internet connection for 60 seconds, we're now in DR. It's failing over and I can't stop it. And they're like, oh. And I'm like, yeah, whatever app servers are up in DR, they're immediately going to be able to start doing writes, and whatever's down in production, you lose. So most shops have kind of unreliable network connections at their main data center, so that gets a little sketchy. The second problem with being able to write into two places at the same time, I'm going to take a really simple example, a table with an identity column. If you have a table with an identity column that starts at 1 and goes up to a bajillion, if you can write in two places, handling identities means that you need to change your application so that in one database, the identity starts at 1 and goes up, and in your other data center, it starts at -1 and goes down. So that way, both of them can continue to insert even when their network is disconnected, because the DR has to be able to keep doing inserts even when it can't see HA. So when I explain stuff like that to people, that's how you end up going down the GUID route for your primary keys or for identifiers, so it just gets a little hairy. So doable bidirectional transactional replication, but just with availability groups, no. And then the last question that we'll take for today, Karthik asks, what's the best way to collect metrics for CPU, memory, and I/O and prove that it's under pressure? Well, you asked best. And so for me, best is a third-party monitoring tool. Go out and buy, I don't really care that passionate. I happen to be wearing a Quest hoodie right now. It's because I used to work for Quest, so I know a bunch of people over there. It's a great company. I love the people dearly. Yep, this is the end of the question queue. There are all kinds of them out there that are pretty good. I'm not usually as worried about which one you pick, but that way it harvests way more metrics than you would possibly be able to capture on your own, and at a lower overhead than you could possibly capture yourself. If you can't do that, if you can't spend $1,000 per server on a month, because they're all about $1,000 a server, if you can't do that, then you could use SP Blitz first to log to table every 15 minutes. And that's covered extensively in the documentation and in my Fundamentals of Server Tuning class. But the thing is, that's not really tuned at all. I don't do any performance tuning on that because I don't really give a damn. It works good enough for me for what I need to use it for. But if I was going to use it on a real mission critical server, that's where I would totally just go buy a third-party tool. And I'll end this with a funny story. So, funny story, when I was hiring or I was applying for DBA roles, back before I was the world famous Brent Ozar, back when I started my blog like 20 years ago, like around 2000, 2001. And in the early years, I was applying for a job at one point, and I got an interview, made it past first round, was interviewing with the second round. And the DBA asked me, he said, Brent, if you were going to collect data about performance on SQL servers, and if you were going to do monitoring type solutions, how would you go about doing it? And I just replied, I was like, I'd go buy something. There's, Quest Spotlight, I'd do a SQL DM, there's all these tools out there. So I'd just go buy one. And he was like, well, would that be your first choice? I said, well, yeah. They're way better than anything that I'm going to write on my own. He's like, well, what about open source? I'm like, well, but if it breaks, who am I going to call? If it's monitoring and it's monitoring my production thing, I want it to be reliable enough. I said, if there was an open source thing that we could call somebody on to get help or whatever, but I wouldn't do that. He goes, well, have you heard about the blank framework, whatever it was? He's like, have you heard about the such and such thing? And I'm like, no, never heard of that one. And the guy got really pissed off, and that was the end of the interview. Turns out that he'd wrote that tool, and he'd published it in SQL Server magazine. That guy was Rodney Landrum. Rodney Landrum of Florida, very active in the SQL Server community. At the time, I didn't know who he was. I didn't read SQL Server magazine. SQL Server magazine has since gone bankrupt. Because who wants to read a magazine about SQL Server? What the hell? But since then, he and I are good friends. I mean, I love him to death. The guy's really smart. He's super giving and all that. But really, at the end of the day, if you're going to go do a monitoring tool on production, why would you not use something that you can call for support? Because if you try to build your own, if you try to go, how hard can it be? I'll collect perf mon counters. What's going to happen is that every time SQL Server blows chunks and has a problem, every time it blows chunks, you're going to be like, I didn't know about that metric. I'm going to add that to my monitoring tool and set a threshold for it. Every time your SQL Server crashes, you're going to be doing that. You're going to be always behind learning about new things that you didn't have the time to learn about at scale. You're going to be constantly finding the bugs in your monitoring product. And your manager is going to look at you like you're a moron. It's going to be like, why is it that every time we have a problem with SQL Server, you couldn't figure out what it was, and your tool that you homegrown wrote didn't handle it? So that's why I would typically do it, is just go buy something off the shelf. Now, having said that, there are open source monitoring frameworks that you can use. They may be of varying quality, but for me, for SQL Server, which costs $2,000 a core for standard and $7,000 a core for enterprise edition, whenever I'm speccing out a new server, I just put in the big long list of costs in there. I put one line in for the monitoring software. I don't even make it an option. I'm like, here's everything that we need for the server, because your manager's eyes are magnetically attracted to the most expensive thing in the list. the most expensive thing in the list is always the SQL Server licensing. So your manager's eyes are razor sharp focused on that, and they go, how can we get that line to cost less? And I'm like, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked. Can you go talk to our Microsoft sales rep? Maybe you can work a deal. And then the Microsoft sales rep and your manager have that arm wrestling contest over at the steakhouse or wherever it is that they do that. They come to terms. And then that way your manager feels like they saved some money without ripping out the part of the budget that you really care about. So that's how I do that. All right, and it's funny, I was going to ask Nick what you thought about that. So Nick says, as someone who builds one of these open source and readily admit, it is a dashboard with what some people need is not a complete solution. We buy something for that. Stack Overflow had their own monitoring solution, and they ended up deprecating it and getting rid of it. Bosun, they ended up trying to write their own full-blown monitoring solution. It's hard, especially when you don't make money on it. It's super hard. All right, well, that brings us to the end of our Q&A session for the week. I want to give another shout out to B-Squid. There are tons of them. Like, I don't really care which one people use. I'm going to give a shout out to this week's sponsor, Column Score. So if you have tables where you think that column store indexes are a good fit, you can go over to columnscore.com and fill out a 7-question quiz on whether or not your tables are a good fit. So thanks a lot for hanging out with me today. I am now going off to go get some coffee and a lox and bagel and start enjoying my weekend in beautiful sunny San Diego. The air quality is even good today for the first time in a while. I'm totally thrilled about that. Thanks everybody for hanging out today. It is wonderful to see everybody again. It's always fun to see my regular audience inside here. And I will see y'all next time. Adios.